Christmas present and Christmas future might still be unknown, but my guest today knows all about Christmas past. In fact, he wrote the book on it. Welcome to the Bookshelf Odyssey podcast. My name is Art. Welcome back. And my guest today is Brian Earl. He's the host of the Christmas podcast, Christmas Past. And I believe you're on season 7 this year, aren't you, Brian?
I am.
I've been listening to your podcast, not since the beginning, but I think you're about season 2 or 3 is when I discovered your podcast. And I was looking for something Christmassy and something cozy. And I found your podcast. And anyway, well, Brian, welcome to the Bookshelf Odyssey podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Been looking forward to this.
Those of who are followers of my podcast, of this podcast, and know that I also host a Christmas podcast, and Brian was very influential to helping me get that started. Some of his ideas. This is almost becoming an urban legend now on YouTube of Christmas videos. You had a Christmas video that you were talking about Christmas podcasts you like to see, and I know several have started in light of that video.
That is true. And I don't know if there's a direct one-to-one for the ones that I requested. And part of me was saying, and I believe this was back in 2018, where when I first started out in 2016, there were not many Christmas podcasts, or at least not many that I could find. You know, you and I know as podcasters, podcast discovery is like a whole thing. But at least when I went looking for Christmas podcasts, I found about a half a dozen or so. And then the following year, I started mine. And then the next year, a ton of them came out. And this isn't a criticism, but what I noticed was that almost all of them were that model where 2 or 3 people review the latest Christmas movies. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. But Christmas is a big topic. Like, there's room for more stuff. And in case anyone needs some ideas, here's my wish list. You know, I would love to see someone do a deep dive on just all Christmas foods, or all just, you know, Christmas, like one area of Christmas history, or just talking about how Christmas is cozy and things like that. And even at the time, there were some music podcasts, but they were mostly playlists of Celtic Christmas music or things, you know, something like that. I said, well, what about someone just doing the history behind Christmas songs? And that was one that I know for sure that Dwayne Bailey reached out to me and said, I'll run with that if you don't mind. And I'll even use that artwork that you put in the video. And I said, sure. The original artwork for Tinsel Tunes was one that I shared in that video. And then if I'm not mistaken, the cozy Christmas one kind of caught your attention. And then you made the idea your own and have been running with that since, I want to say 2018. Is that right? Or 2019?
No, actually 2020 was the...
Was it really?
Yeah, my pandemic project. And yeah. So it's 2 years. It's been 2 years. Yeah, for that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and shout out to Glenn, who does Seasons Eatings. And again, I don't know if there's any connection between that and the video that I made. However, that was one of the things that I said I'd really want to see. And you know, he's a baker, and so he has a lot to say about that. He's been on my show a couple times.
And I wanted to have you on. Especially because you've just written a book about Christmas past. Why don't you go ahead and just tell folks a little bit about yourself and your idea behind this book?
Yeah, well, the podcast itself started it has its origins in 2015, where I was listening to what Christmas podcasts there were. And there was one by a man named Lee Cameron called The Christmas Stocking, which I still think is one of the best ever, even though he stopped producing episodes in 2018. And he was sort of telling the stories behind Christmas traditions. And I wanted something like that, but with a very particular feel to it, kind of like a deep dive into a topic that also had kind of engaging storytelling. And I was listening to a lot of NPR style podcasts, and I literally typed in, like NPR Christmas podcast into what back then was still iTunes. And I couldn't find anything like that, anything remotely. NPR does have a Christmas podcast, but it's a collection of their favorite driveway moments from the season. And I said, I can't be the only person who wants something like this. And since no one else seems to be volunteering, I'm going to give this a try myself, even though I had no business doing it, because the vision I had in my head really was something modeled after NPR style storytelling. And so, I'm not a writer, I'm not a journalist, I'm not any kind of academic. I didn't even know where I was going to find people. But what I did know was that I was going to explain these topics using a lot of storytelling. I wasn't just going to read you the Wikipedia page about a Christmas tradition. So it had to be interesting, but it also had to be engaging. You needed to feel like you're going through a narrative. And for every tradition, I needed to find the absolute most qualified expert I could to help me tell the story. And so over the years, I mean, I've talked to the CEO of a candy cane factory. I've talked to professors of the history of fashion design, things like that. Someone who runs a professional Santa Claus school, botanist, horticulturist, linguist. I mean, just people from all these diverse fields, each of whom has something interesting to say about a particular Christmas tradition. But the general concept of the podcast itself was really born out of the idea that, sure, Christmas is the most wonderful time of the year, but it's also the most fascinating because there's no other cultural phenomenon where we so drastically change the world. We change the way it looks, we change the way it smells and sounds, and we even change a lot about ourselves. We change a lot of our routines and our attitudes. We tend to become more generous and charitable. We even change the way we talk, for crying out loud. Or when else do you use the word merry, except during Christmas, or humbug, or use phrases like the Lord is come. And so that's fascinating. It's not unique to Christmas because generally what I'm talking about is the concept of festivity. And I think that's just a uniquely human trait where we change our behaviors in our environment to do things like celebrate special events or mark the passage of time or the changing of the seasons. But nowhere is that more prominently on display than at Christmas time. But then for every particular Christmas tradition, there's the story of where it came from. And almost always it's a forgotten story. Or if you know the story behind it, you don't know as much of it as you think, because these things tend to ripple out nearly infinitely. It's like the butterfly effect, where something that you would think would be completely unrelated to Christmas would have an influence in the way that you and I recognize Christmas today. And I go into this, and maybe we can get into some of these traditions, but we wouldn't have Christmas as we know it without if rail travel hadn't become common in the 19th century, if refrigeration and transportation technologies weren't what they are today, if we didn't have a functioning postal service, like all the printing techniques, things, I think on the one hand, there are things that are really obvious. We wouldn't have Christmas as we know it today without electricity or recorded music or movies. But there's this whole hidden layer of things that we take for granted that are really, really very interesting and feed into the story. And so I wanted to tell those stories. And again, I had no idea where to start. I just knew I was going to reach out to people and ask and just do interviews. And you know this from starting a podcast, the first season's always the hardest when you're nobody, nobody knows who you are. And I also knew that every episode I wanted to have Christmas memories from listeners. And again, that first season is almost exclusively just my friends and family. I think it took a while before I could build up some momentum. So that first season, I went into it with no expectations at all. It was more a creative project for me. There was this thing I went looking for. It didn't exist. And I said, well, I wonder if I could try my hand at that. And again, because there were so few Christmas podcasts and none of them were like hit podcasts at the time, I went into it with thinking this will just be a fun way for me to express my Christmas spirit and have a Christmassy hobby that I can work on kind of through the burr months, because I needed to start around the fall to make sure it was ready for the winter. But then the first season just got a really great response, like more than I could have imagined. And so then I said, okay, we'll try another and another. So then in, I think 2020 is the year of the pandemic, where I think a lot of people just kind of had nothing to do and were listening to a lot of podcasts where I just had the best season yet. I mean, the numbers, I try not to pay too much attention to those, but we all do. Let's admit it. So I was looking at some download numbers and I said, it seems that I've crossed a threshold. So the show has grown to a point where it's ready for whatever is next. And a book felt like the natural next step because if you listen to my show, it's pretty obvious. It's a very scripted show. I mean, it kind of has to be. If you kind of listen to an episode, you'll get what I mean. And so what it meant was that a lot of the raw material for a book is already there. It was really a matter of shaping it into something that's more appropriate for a book. So I want to emphasize that every chapter in the book actually does come from an episode of the podcast, but it is absolutely not just the transcribed episodes on the page. I mean, I wouldn't put my name on something like that because it really needs to feel like it needs to match the medium for which it's being presented, which is The book is meant to be very visual, has lots of images and sidebars and little factoids. I really like the way that they did at the publisher, the typesetting and things like that. And that every chapter is meant to be read in, about the time it takes you to drink a cup of hot chocolate, right? So there's 26 chapters. Each one focuses on one tradition. And the idea is that it's meant for casual perusal. This is not a dense history of Christmas. This isn't an academic thing. It's meant to go on the coffee table. You sit down, you have it open while you're, maybe watching TV or having your coffee or something like that. And, you kind of pass it around and give it as a gift. So yeah, this is for the YouTube people only. For people listening at home, I swear I'm holding up a copy of the book right now. Christmas Past, the fascinating stories behind our favorite holidays traditions. Yeah.
That's now available everywhere. By the time this episode comes out, it'll be probably early December. So
Yeah.
your book is available everywhere at this
It
point.
is, yeah. Yeah, so all the normal places you would look to find a book, you'll almost certainly find it there. And yeah, I mean, availability is kind of a funny thing because you've been able to buy it since April, but you won't receive it until so it doesn't start shipping out until November 1st.
Yeah, I think I pre-ordered it way back then. So yeah,
Oh, thanks.
I was pretty excited about it. I mean, your podcast really just helped me find a great hobby and something I enjoy doing, and has really kind of taken over my life now. But that's in the power of stories. I mean, Christmas, so much about Christmas. There's stories that are centered around whether it's Santa Claus or over Jesus, over nature, whatever. So many people have brought in their beliefs to it, and I think I've said before, it's kind of like, well, this was more in connection with Santa, but it's kind of like it's the story that we're all writing together. That we're creating parts of it and creating traditions, and it's a joy. It's so fun. But there's just a lot of power in story.
And I think you're right about how we write the story every time that we celebrate Christmas. And this is actually, I say this at the beginning of the book, and I kind of close the book returning to this idea is the two main themes that come up on the show are, number one, that Christmas is just always evolving. You literally don't have the same Christmas twice in a row. And I think it's, on the one hand, that's pretty obvious to think, well, Christmas today probably isn't much like it was back in medieval times, right? So the large changes are visible to us, but the small ones are not. Or I suppose if you look back in the 60s or 50s and say, okay, well, we don't have aluminum Christmas trees anymore. But there are lots and lots of ways in which Christmas is changing right before our eyes right now and become part of the narrative that, our grandchildren or great-great-grandchildren will look back at this, and a lot of the things that we're doing will be seen as something that they used to do for Christmas and no longer do. So there's that the Christmas is always fluid and changing. And what that means is that the Christmas we celebrate today, and I'm using that phrase very deliberately, the Christmas. There is no Christmas. There is just the version of it we have today because it's always changing. It's a collection of traditions from different points in history and different parts of the world, but it is not the complete collection, like not even close to the complete collection, and it won't be the final one. And I think the most interesting thing within that collection that we celebrate today is that there are things that you probably think are much, much older than they are, like Christmas trees, for example, are a lot newer than you probably think they are. Santa Claus, much newer than you probably think he is. And I'm happy to go into detail on any of those.
Why is it important to remember Christmas's past, especially if everything is changing and fluid? Is it important, and why?
Yeah, I mean, because what we're talking about is tradition. I mean, tradition is this idea of returning to something. And, there are some traditions that you'll only practice once in your life, like wedding traditions for a lot of people, you only get married once. But when it comes to something like Christmas, we come back to it every year. And part of what we're doing when we're gathering and reminiscing is really reinforcing social bonds or reinforcing warm memories about things that happened in the past, even though they might not be part of what we do anymore. In some cases, that's true because they can't be, because people, who were part of that past are no longer with us or things like that. So I think, honoring Christmas past is part of what helps bring it forward. It is the foundation upon which we build the next chapter of Christmas. And I opened the book with this analogy that I heard from my very first interview I ever did for Christmas Past was the historian Bruce David Forbes from Morningside College. He wrote a book called Candid Christmas. And he said, think of Christmas like a snowball. if you imagine a snowball that you're rolling along, as it rolls along, it gets bigger. Not only that, but it picks up pieces of everything that lay in its path. And then also, sooner or later, pieces of it are going to fall off because it just gets too big or misshapen or starts to buckle under its own weight. And I always return to that image of like, Christmas is just, it's always moving. It's always picking up things as it moves through time and through space. I think it's kind of done moving through space, right? I mean, and I don't mean like in the, astronomical sense. I mean, it's basically covered the globe, right? Like there are very few people on Earth who don't know about Christmas. But then, pieces of it fall off. And the only way for us to really, I don't know if preserve is the right word, because if we're abandoning them, we're not preserving them, but to remember them is through remembering the past, whether that's just through capturing them in the history, or just reminiscing about them with family.
For some of us, as we get older, I'm starting to realize some of that is changing even just for our family, the things we do. My son's in college. He has a pretty serious girlfriend right now. So, last year he had to make time to spend with her family, and some of the things we did had to change. And it can be kind of unsettling, but also, realizing, hey, this is good because we don't know what's coming next. Who knows? And what changes could come, and fun changes that could come. So then you had mentioned, in your story about, or in your book, some of the history behind things like our traditions, like the Christmas tree. That's one of my favorite parts of Christmas is decorating the tree, having it lit. The ornaments I put on are usually ones that are family connected. We pick them up on vacations, different things. And so it's become like a scrapbook. So I'm going to put you on the spot here, perhaps, but what can you tell us a little about the history of something like the Christmas tree?
Well, as I already kind of mentioned, it's the idea of having a Christmas tree in your living room around Christmas time is really new. The idea of a Christmas tree itself is not really new. And I think we can start with, I'm actually doing an episode about Christmas trees this season on the podcast. And the way that I start the episode out is saying, we don't really know when we can begin this story. Some people trace it back to ancient Babylon. And obviously not Christmas, right? But the idea of using trees. And I think probably the best place to start was in a prehistoric time where our ancestors would, they're working the fields all the time, and then everything dies, and then they have to go huddle close together throughout the winter. But then there are certain trees and certain plants like holly and ivy and the evergreen trees that don't seem to get affected by winter. And so naturally they assume there must be something special about these trees. And that kind of assumption that there must be something special evolves into all kinds of beliefs about them having medicinal properties, and even about them having a spirit that inhabits them. And so there's a word called the hamadryad. This is the spirit that lives in a tree. Sometimes the idea would also be translated into thinking that a tree might be associated with a certain god. And so the oak tree was thought to be related to the god Thor. And I believe it was Germany, there was a couple of, I don't know what the word, like civilizations that had a ritual around what is now Christmas time, where they would do a human sacrifice on the oak tree, a sacrifice to Thor. And it very gruesome, but they would do a sacrifice, usually be like a child. And I kind of hesitate to go into the details of this because it is so gruesome, but Thor had a hammer, so put two and two together. Sure. And so then, according to legend, Saint Boniface, who was a missionary who went around to these places trying to convert people to Christianity, in the year 722, came upon one of these sacrifices in progress and was able to stop it. What he did is then chop down the oak tree, and standing behind it, and again, this is how you know it's a legend because it's all just too convenient, was a fir tree. And he said, okay, what you're going to do is take that oak tree that we just felled, cut it up into lumber, and build a chapel to St. Peter, I think it was. And that fir tree, that's your new symbol. Use that. Like it's a nice peaceful tree. It's the tree of the Christ child. Now, there's a parallel track, right? So the idea of like trees being somehow special, right? And then you see in other celebrations like Roman Saturnalia, they would use things like holly and ivy to decorate statues or to bring into the home. There were kinds of superstitions where maybe this helps to ward off evil spirits, etc. And to be sure, when it comes to what kind of greenery we decorate the home with at Christmas, for the longest time, it was holly and ivy. That's what you brought
Mm.
into your house. That was the main focus of the Christmas decorating. But certain places would use the Christmas tree, mostly around Germany. It was a regional tradition at best. However, it then starts to spread. So the Christmas tree actually starts making it into the royal family, right? There's a German princess, I think it was Queen Catherine, who brought it into the royal family,
Mm-hmm.
but it didn't really spread much outside of the royal family because the royals weren't very popular until around the middle of the 19th century. Along comes Queen Victoria, and her husband was German, and so he brought the Christmas tree into it was Windsor Castle, and then there was a famous etching of that done with the family standing around the Christmas tree with gifts underneath it, and it was published in a very influential women's magazine. So a couple things happen. You have a popular monarchy at the time, and then you have this rise in print media where you can take an idea and just spread it all over the place. I mean, that was not possible before. So much of our Christmas traditions that we celebrate now have to do with the availability of being able to socialize an image through the influence of media. Around
Mm-hmm.
the same time, this is the middle of the 19th century, Franklin Pierce on this side of the Atlantic is the first president to have a Christmas tree in the White House. And so at that point, we're kind of off to the races. Like the Christmas tree has its formal
Yeah.
debut. And so you might say, okay, well, you said it's kind of new. And, from the year 700 up till the 1850s, that is a pretty, kind of late in the party for that thing to become popular all of a sudden. But the story doesn't end
Right.
there, because you have to imagine in the middle of the 18th or the 19th century, if you too, caught the bug, you saw that in the magazine and you wanted one, well, what was your choices, right? You don't go to Target and get a fake one, and you don't go down to the Christmas tree lot. You go out in the woods and you cut one down. And in Germany, a lot of people were doing that, and it was causing all kinds of concerns about deforestation and conservation. That's actually where artificial Christmas trees come from. The very first version of an artificial Christmas tree was what's known as a feather tree. And it was like dyed goose feathers tied to a dowel that were made to look like a tree. But anyway, we don't it's not until we get to the late 19th or early 20th century that people start growing Christmas trees on farms and bringing them into like the cities to be sold. So imagine that, like, the first generation of people for whom, if you celebrate Christmas, you probably have a tree in your living room, was about the
Mm-hmm.
1910s. I mean, that's, for someone like my age, that's my great grandparents. I mean, that's not ancient history. I actually have
Yeah.
pictures of
Yeah.
my great grandparents. These are people, like, I know their names, I know what they look like, who are among the first Americans anyway to have Christmas trees. So a lot of our traditions are like that. Like they're the story behind them goes on and on and on for a long time, millennia in many cases, but the story about them becoming the thing that they are today is just like decades old, like just one or two or three generations, and sometimes a lot newer than that.
Yeah. And that's, in part what I like about your podcast, and exploring those stories behind you know, kind of the stories behind the story.
Mm-hmm.
And you dig into it, and you find how legend and tradition gets passed down and built on. And then, today, we have this giant pine tree in the middle of our room, in the living room. And how did that happen?
And that's
Yeah.
the thing. I think
It's
it
neat.
sounds like such an
Yeah.
obvious thing to say, but if you celebrate Christmas, you always have. And so this
Mm-hmm.
feels normal to you, right? It's the kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
like, maybe once or twice during the season, you might think like, oh yeah, wait, what is eggnog all about? But if you came from outer space and you looked at Christmas, you'd say, what is going on here? Like, this is such an odd collection of things that people are doing or saying or eating, and then they do it for about a month or 6 weeks out of the year, and then they stop. Like, that is very fascinating, and it's really the result of many
Yeah.
stories coming together at the same time.
Do you have any hunches as to where Christmas future is taking us?
I think
Hmm.
almost all new changes to Christmas, and by new I mean 20th century and onward, are almost always influenced by commerce. People always love to say, well, Christmas is becoming so commercial. And it's like, no, it's not. We are becoming more commercial. It would be more
Mm.
surprising if Christmas did not become more commercial. I mean, once we moved, and I mean specifically in America, from a post-agricultural based economy and became mostly an industrial based economy, where most of the things that we consume come from stores or are made in factories, and that, most of us are not
Mhm.
farmers. Before the Civil War, right? Like more than half of America were farmers. That's not true anymore. And so obviously all of that stuff gets reflected in Christmas, because at the end of the day, Christmas is just people doing things that people do just in a very particular way. Um, and so yeah, it's a common criticism I hear of Christmas. Oh, it's just going to keep getting more and more commercial. It's going to keep coming earlier every year. And it's like, well, it's going to reflect our current attitudes toward things like commerce, charity, religion, and so on. And so there was a really
Mhm.
interesting study that came out in 2013, a large study by Pew Research, asking people how they celebrate Christmas now as compared to how they celebrated it growing up. And some of the findings are things you probably would expect. Like fewer people now say they go to church as part of Christmas, without editorializing the meaning. I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that that's a trend. Fewer people go
Mhm.
caroling. I think that's pretty obvious. But there was a double-digit increase in people who put up a tree, which I found really interesting. I
Mm.
never would have guessed that fewer of us are putting up trees. I think there
Mhm.
are other things that are happening now that might have the makings of long-term changes, and other things that don't. They're mere fashion trends. I think on the fashion trend side, think of the ugly Christmas sweater. I tend to think that's going to
Yeah.
go away. And I personally, just between you and me, I kind of hope it's going to go away. But the reason I think it's going to go away is that it follows almost exactly the same trajectory as the aluminum Christmas tree. Meaning when it came out, it was very polarizing. Either you loved it or you loved to hate it.
Yeah.
Number two, once it became commercially viable, a bunch of competitors come into the space. And then, as often happens with these kinds of trends, kind of floods the market, too many competitors. Everyone who wants one has one or two or three. The market collapses, then it disappears. And then, in the 2020s and 2030s, we're going to look back and say, oh, yeah, remember that thing in the 2010s, in the early 2020s, the ugly Christmas sweater? It becomes a relic. I think that's what's going to happen with the ugly Christmas sweater. But
Mm.
more culturally, we can look at the last 20 years and think about the way that we shop for Christmas. I mean, I haven't set foot in a store to shop for Christmas in a long time. And again, that's just the way that we
Yeah.
are as a society now, not just at Christmas, right? That's just, of course, our shopping habits translate to Christmas. But think how that changes Christmas culture. I remember when I was growing up or in early adulthood, that a big part of the season was making time to go to the shopping mall, and all of
Mhm.
that has been erased from the culture. The only reason you would do that is if you like it. It's not necessary anymore. Um,
Which I don't.
and thank
Yeah.
goodness for that. But think of like just how much more time you have. I mean,
Yeah.
is that part of the reason that all those
Right.
Hallmark movies are becoming more popular? We have more time to just sit on the sofa and order things from Amazon on our phones. Um, I think another thing is cultural divides. And again, this is something that's happening in
Mhm.
the culture itself. So of course we're going to see it reflected in Christmas. A study came out last year that said 37% of Americans really truly believe that we have some kind of war on Christmas. And again, it doesn't matter where
Mhm.
you fall on that argument. The fact of the matter is that's part of Christmas culture now. And at the very same time,
Mhm.
we're starting to see more people calling out, the lyrics for "Baby It's Cold Outside" because, oh, those, that might have been something that was acceptable in the 40s, but that doesn't really reflect modern values about, the interactions between romantic partners. We want to change that kind of thing now. Um, and so,
Yeah.
if you look to Hallmark movies, it's almost like they're kind of the canary in the coal mine. Like whatever's going on in culture, you'll almost always see reflected in the world of Christmas romance movies, because they started to become a lot more
Mhm.
inclusive the last couple of years, like same-sex
Mhm.
couples, and like just giving a lot more different voices to their stories. But then a competing network came along and said, "Oh, well, hey, if that's a little too edgy or woke for you, we'll fill that void by providing things that are like a lot more of the sanitized conservative kind of thing that you want." And again, I'm not editorializing here. Like that's just what's happening. And I
Mhm.
think it's something that we're going to continue to see. I think we just tend to become more divided. And I like to hope that Christmas would be a thing that brings us together, but I think there are certain areas in which we see that it's there are opportunities within Christmas to highlight the ways in which we're different.
The old adage that when the family gets together and don't talk politics, that could really be the
Hmm.
go-to standard this year. Like, don't
But
mention it.
I think one of the biggest changes that we're also seeing is playing around with the length of the Christmas season. So whenever I hear people say,
Yeah.
"Oh, it's too early for Christmas," I always wait till Thanksgiving, and it's like, well, where do you think that idea comes from? That Christmas happens the day after Thanksgiving? It wasn't always that way, you know. That was again early 20th century. Retailers in New York City, like Macy's, wanted the Christmas season to last for a month. So they would have a big parade on
Hmm.
Thanksgiving and make sure Santa Claus was at the end. The idea that Christmas is the 5 weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas is contrived. Someone thought that up. So nowadays, when people are like, oh, well, I see the decorations on the shelf around Halloween, that's too early. And says who, right? And
Yeah.
even before that early 20th century, Christmas, the season started on Christmas Day. The season leading up to Christmas was
Hmm.
Advent. The Christmas season started on Christmas Day and went to January 6th, the 12 days of Christmas. So even like what we consider the Christmas season is very fluid and malleable. It really kind of, it's all in the eye of the beholder. But I think what we're seeing now
Right.
is a move toward it really is moving back farther and farther. And again, it really is driven by commerce, but also
Yeah.
it's also being bolstered by people like you and me who really find community and just a chance to amplify our voices on things like social media, where I think in the last few
Right.
years, we're embracing this notion of the Burr months, like every month ending in BER. So September through December, basically the last third of the year is this kind of extended Christmas season. And I think I, it'll be a few generations before more people accept that. But with the Hallmark Christmas
Hmm.
countdown to Christmas starting the week before Halloween, I mean, I think it's working its way into the culture. I think more and more people give it a generation before the idea that Christmas season starts on or right after Thanksgiving on Black Friday. That's going to be a kind of
Hmm.
an antiquated idea.
No, absolutely. I can remember as a kid, the Christmas stuff didn't even come out until I think it was in our house, that first weekend in December,
Hmm.
I maybe in later if needed. And maybe it's the influence of Black Friday, happening right after Thanksgiving, and then that moves it back. And yeah, like I can see what you're saying, definitely. And then you get stores like craft stores like Hobby Lobby that they have
Hmm.
to get stuff out in August for crafters to be able to have time to put stuff together. So might as well just
Hmm.
decorate it, and make it a big party. And
Yeah.
yeah. Now, so writing a Christmas book and really doing a Christmas podcast, do you find it hard to maintain Christmas spirit throughout the year? Do you think it makes
Um,
Christmas time itself less special?
I'm really careful about how I do it. My
Mm.
office, you see behind me, I have some Christmas lights. But most of the year, it's the decoration in my office is sort of vaguely suggestive of Christmas. It looks a little bit more wintry than Christmassy. And even when the Burr months come out, it's not like all of a sudden I'm just, okay, Christmas music, Christmas movies. I even just have a personal rule that I don't indulge in any Christmassy treats until after Thanksgiving. That's mostly for health reasons. If I started in September pounding down Christmas cookies, I probably wouldn't be feeling that great come New Year. And then
No.
also now I have a yeah. I was just texting with my brothers today, and they sent a picture of how the eggnog is out on the shelves already. And I
Mm.
said, "Oh yeah, I know." But then my brother said, "Oh yeah, we even have some at home already." And I said, oh, "Even for me, that's just too early." Um, so I've sort of found a way to very slowly ramp up. Like September, yes, it's the beginning of the Christmas season for me. I mean, to be totally serious about it for a minute,
Hmm.
but I ramp it up very, very slowly. And now I have a certain like tripwire in my schedule where I can't put up the Christmas tree until after my son's birthday, which is in November, early November.
Hmm.
So, it's my wife's rule. Like we need to fully celebrate his birthday before we can celebrate anything else. And so I'll probably put up the Christmas tree, I don't know, middle of November or something like that, and have about a good month or so before we fly out to Boston. But no, I mean, I feel like the fact that I want to have a book and the fact that I want to have a Christmas podcast means that my Christmas spirit is pretty strong. And I'm really careful to
Hmm.
know, like, you don't want to give yourself too much of a good thing because then, yeah, you just ruin it for yourself. It becomes, if it's all the time, it no longer becomes
Yeah.
special. So they're little tricks. I mean, I think
Right,
it's
right.
kind of like, at the end of Scrooge when he says, "I'll keep Christmas in my heart," or whatever the quote is there. That's mostly what I do, right? It's always somewhere, but then it kind of dial it up or dial it down depending on the time of year.
Hmm. Yeah, our stores have the eggnog out too, and I'm waiting till at least after Halloween to buy the first little container. But yeah, I gotta go slow, or it's gonna be ugly come Christmas time.
I do little
um,
things like to
but
prep because
yeah,
you can make mincemeat like
uh-huh.
way early, so because you
Hmm.
douse it in alcohol and all that. And so I've been doing that like every weekend, making candied citrus peel and mincemeat, and I'm gonna make a pudding I think this week because because it can and actually is supposed to kind of sit there for about a month or two where you feed it brandy and all that. So those are my little ways of getting into the spirit without necessarily feeling like pretending it's Christmas when we all know that it isn't.
I love Christmas music, and
Mhm.
I will have albums, especially I only listen to, after Thanksgiving versus all year round.
Yeah.
And, and I don't listen to it all year round, but some once in a while, like, in August, July, I just feel like, I need a little Christmas music. And
Hmm.
so I'll have some music I can put on just to give me that little taste. And yeah, it's good. Oh, and yeah, I wanted to also ask then, this is your first book. So do you have any future plans to write more?
Yeah, I mean, again, the first book, it just seemed like a natural next evolution for the podcast, again, because a lot of the material is already there. And now with
Hmm.
having, I think it's like 180 episodes I have. I mean, there's plenty of material for more books. I think we kind of have to see how this one does to see if anyone's interested in doing a second one. So I can certainly do more in the vein of the one that just came out, but I think I have other different ideas that I want to take this. I mean, it's an endless topic. There's so much that you can do with it. Um, and I kind of look at some of the other Christmas podcasters. The Deck the Hallmark guys had a book. They have another one that came out this year. It's more of a children's book. I don't think I'm a children's book guy, but there's lots of different things you could do with it. And then the idea for all of this, for the most part, was for me to have a Christmassy hobby I could work on, a kind of creative outlet for my Christmas spirit. And so, the book and the
Hmm.
podcast are just kind of ways of taking this thing. I think, at the core, I hate to say my brand because that sounds a little overinflated, but it's, a way
Yeah.
of thinking and talking about Christmas where curiosity and fascination are front and center, and where there's a strong element of storytelling. It's kind of equal parts nerdy deep dive and warm-hearted celebration. And it's like, well, what else can I translate that into? I mean, certainly books are just one opportunity. There's endless other things. I think it's just a matter of choosing the next thing and prioritizing it.
So we're gonna see Brian Earl sings the best of Christmas, or
Not much of a singer.
yeah. No, I'm with you there. Looking at just Christmas as a whole, what's your favorite part of Christmas?
This is going to sound like a non-answer, but I promise it really is what
Hmm.
I feel. It's just the overall atmosphere. It's almost like saying, like, what's your favorite part of like going out in the snow? And it's like, well, I mean, I could just say the snow, but it's more like, well, the atmosphere that it creates. Just when the
Hmm.
house is decorated and there's music going on, and it smells like something with cinnamon and ginger and cloves is baking, and that I'm going to go out with my son later on and go look at some Christmas lights and all of those things. I mean, it's not necessarily that I really look forward to watching Rudolph, but I look forward to there being a time of year where there's that kind of anticipation about something like that feels cozy and festive and triggers warm memories. And so I see so many people, I do this too on social media, counting down to Christmas, and like I look at that as a negative. I'm like, not that there are 61 days till Christmas. I think at the time we're recording this, it's 58 or 59 days till Christmas.
Yeah,
But
right
that
around there.
there are only 59 days left of this before it all stops, and then we move into the worst quarter of the year, or January through March, where there's just not a lot going on. Um, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't count down the days to Christmas. Christmas actually is probably the most hectic of days within all of that. It's the season that I really
Hmm.
love the most. And yeah, that countdown kind of feels like, no, 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 this is, you're watching an opportunity slip away. Every single one of these days has to count because there won't be more
Hmm.
of them after the season ends. Um, so yeah, I mean, things I'm looking forward to this year because my son, this will be his third Christmas. He's turning 2, so he was a couple of weeks old for last Christmas. Is just reintroduce, showing him my Christmas for the first time. And then,
Hmm.
I mean, literally the third time for him, but he's just now starting to get it. So one of the things I
Yeah.
did over the summer is buy a box of Christmas crackers, and he loves those. And making a gingerbread house with him, and also seeing like how my Christmas is gonna merge with what he brings to it. There's the way that I celebrate Christmas, which I took from my mom, where she had what she did with her dad, and you kind of, as I continue celebrating Christmas, it's not going to be the same anymore, because a lot of the things that we do for Dash are going to come into it. A lot of the things that he likes, we're going to pay special emphasis to. And it's almost like, for every piece that you gain, you kind of lose one too when it comes to
Hmm.
Christmas. So like you were saying, as your son grows up and he has a girlfriend, goes off to college, and it all, it changes a lot, and it changes
Hmm.
quickly, and it really, the changes from one year to the next are very, very drastic. So yeah, this
Hmm.
year, I think the thing I'm looking forward to most is we're going to Boston. We haven't flown with him since the pandemic, so he's going to meet his whole extended
Mm.
family for the first time, which will be exciting.
All right. And
Yeah.
you'll probably get a nice white Christmas then.
You never know. Because I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and we had white Christmases all the time. If
Hmm.
not snow on Christmas, at least there'd, be something on the ground. The last couple Christmases, it was like t-shirt weather. I mean, it just changed a
Hmm.
lot there. So I
Well,
hope that would be fantastic if we had one.
before we go, I do like to ask a couple of questions of all my guests, just
All right.
because we love books here. Do you have a favorite book, or what have you been reading lately you'd like to recommend to us?
Lately, I've been reading this author named Patrick Taylor. He has a book called The Irish Country Christmas. I think he's a doctor, and so there's a lot, like, the story is populated by these two doctors in rural Ireland, I think in the 1960s, and
Hmm.
it's just one of those very cozy books. There's not too much of a plot, but it's just about this Irish village around Christmas time. It's the kind of book that you read on the sofa with a blanket on and just kind of curl up into.
Yeah.
And then for non-Christmas stuff, I've been reading or rereading a lot of William Trevor's short stories. He's my favorite short story writer by a long, long shot. And so every now and then I like to kind of dip back into some of his collections and read some of his stories.
I don't think I've heard of him. What has he written that's
Ooh.
would be
Um, I would say my favorite short story of his is The Piano Tuner's Wives.
mhm.
I really think if you needed to show somebody like this is what a short story is, this is how they're supposed to, like, if you needed just kind of a master class in the potential of the short story as a literary art form, I would start and end with that story. It's nearly perfect.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's what I like about asking this question. I'm usually going to get something new to read. So
Mm-hmm.
wonderful. And then, would you have any advice for a new writer? I know you're a new writer yourself, but
Mm-hmm.
what advice would you have maybe given even yourself, a few months ago or a few years ago?
Um, well, in my day job, I'm a software designer. And the
Mm.
process for any kind of design is really just the basic creative process where you just start. I mean, imagine like a potter. The first thing you do is just get a big lump of something onto the wheel to start shaping. And so that's kind of the approach I take to design. It's the approach I take to writing, where you do it in layers. The first layer, I mean, if I look at the things that I produce for Christmas past, the first draft wouldn't even really count as writing. Like, honestly, it's a collection of pictures that I copy and paste off the internet, things that I dictate into my phone's voice memo, fragments of things, just like, bookmarked pages. It's really just this raw gathering process where
Mhm.
then you try to, like, okay, what shape does this have? Right. So again, like, you just start to, like, pile it together and then try to come up with an order. It's not even until the third pass that I'm like, okay, I'm actually writing. I'm actually trying to sequence this stuff and think about word choices or whatever. So that's the advice I'd give to anyone starting to write. It's like your first draft, it's not even that it's okay if it's terrible. It's like it can't be anything other than terrible. You just need to lean into that and just be okay with it. Because if that's your mental blocker, you're not going to get anywhere into the good stuff.
Mhm.
You're just going to keep spinning your wheels at the beginning process. So, yeah, be messy and just, I had an old art teacher who said, you start with a broom and you end with a toothpick. That's how I've always kind of remembered that.
That's neat. Yeah. One of my favorite authors was or is Ray Bradbury. He would always say about writing, just don't think, just do it. If you start thinking, obviously you want to think about your story and stuff, but his point is don't think about, should I do it? Should I not? Just jump in and do it and work, and it'll work itself out. Yeah. I
But
love
it's
that
also
approach. Yeah.
the value is you need to get it external from your head. You need it to be outside of you so that you can look at it from a
Hmm.
30,000-foot view and think about where you're going to move the pieces around. You cannot gain perspective on your own thoughts because you're always right in the middle of them. It's like trying to see the forest for the trees. You need to get some perspective. And the way to do that is like you dump your thoughts out into something that you can then look at as external things rather than things happening inside your head in the moment.
So that reminds me, during the pandemic, my wife had us once in a while, we'd have like a daily um, challenge or activity. And one of the activities that would sometimes come up would be, okay, today we're going to write a story. And I just recently looked back at them now. I hadn't really looked at them since then. And a lot of mine were kind of dark and kind of like my kids were like, Dad, are you okay over there? And I see that now, that time has passed. And I thought, wow, that really was kind of a dark time for a lot of us, wasn't
Mhm.
it? Yeah. Brian, thank you so much for coming on. Again,
Thank
folks,
you.
he's written the book called Christmas Past, and it's a spin-off book of his podcast, and I highly recommend both. If you're in the mood to get into in the Christmas spirit, it's a wonderful podcast, and I fully expect the book will be just as lovely and makes a great Christmas present this year for those Christmas fans in your family and in your life. So, Brian, thank you for coming on.
Thank you. I enjoyed this.
All right. Take care.